When you reach 70, you stop expecting surprises. Life slows down. Mornings become about coffee instead of deadlines. And the people you once raised start believing they know better than you ever did. My name's Edward Lane, and until that afternoon, I thought I'd done a decent job being a father. I had built my company from a single truck, worked through blizzards, and raised my daughter on the promise that kindness always came back. Turns out, sometimes kindness has to take the long road home. I didn't realize that lesson again until the day of her wedding. The day my brand new son-in-law leaned in close, smiled like a man who thought he'd just won life's lottery, and said, "The greatest gift you can give us is if you disappear." That sentence didn't just cut me. It rewrote the way I saw him, my daughter, and everything I'd worked for. And that's where this story begins, with a man who thought he could erase me with a single sentence. I still remember the smell of polished oak floors and imported roses that day. It was the kind of wedding where the champagne never stopped flowing and the photographers treated it like a royal event. I wasn't flashy, never had been. My gray suit was clean but old as Sam 1 ED. Worn to my late wife. I stood quietly in the corner, watching my daughter in her white gown. She was radiant, and for a brief second, I forgot how tense things had become. But then he arrived. Bevan, my future son-in-law. With that smug Harvard business smile that could sell sand to a desert. He shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. If I'd known the kind of words he'd whispered to me later that night, maybe I'd have walked away before giving them my blessing. You see, I hadn't come to the wedding empty-handed. I had prepared a gift, something meaningful, something my wife and I had once dreamed of giving our daughter. It wasn't jewelry or a car. It was a check for $890,000, representing years of sweat, sacrifice, and savings. It was enough for them to start life debt-free, to buy a home, and to secure a future together. I'd even signed over part of my company's stock to her name, ensuring she'd never have to depend on anyone. But I never got to give that gift with pride, because before the night ended, I realized he saw my generosity as weakness and my love as something to be mocked. During the reception, I caught snippets of conversations, Evan bragging about how he'd soon streamline my daughter's life, how old money habits needed to go, how her dad's been hanging on to outdated traditions. He said it laughing, surrounded by his friends, people who wore confidence like armor and had never lifted a box heavier than a golf club. My daughter laughed along, maybe out of nerves, maybe out of love. I didn't blame her. Not yet. I just smiled, pretending not to hear. Because sometimes, silence is the only dignity left in a room full of arrogance. But inside, I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't let him mistake silence for surrender. When the dancing ended, he approached me. Drinking and his tie loosened. He leaned close enough for the smell of whiskey to replace the roses and said with a smirk, "You've done enough, old man. The greatest gift you can give us is if you disappear." He thought he was being clever. He thought the crowd's laughter behind him would drown out my reaction. But all I did was nod, set down my glass, and look him straight in the eye. Because men like him always think they're in control until they realize the quiet ones built the ground they're standing on. And in that moment, I decided I wouldn't disappear. I'd just let time do the teaching. That night, I went home to my quiet house. The porch light flickered like it always did. My wife's photo sat by the fireplace, her smile calm, as if she knew I'd need her patience again. I poured myself a cup of tea and placed the $890,000 check on the table. It looked different now. Not as a gift, but as a test. A question life had just asked me. How much is respect worth? I folded it neatly, put it back in the envelope, and whispered, "Guess we'll find out." Because sometimes the greatest lesson isn't in what you give it, in what you take back. I wasn't born into wealth. My father was a mechanic who fixed things other people threw away, and my mother cleaned houses until her hands cracked from bleach. From them, I learned two things: how to work and how to keep quiet while doing it. When you grow up fixing things, you start believing that everything broken can be mended. People, too. But I would soon learn that not everything wants to be fixed. Some things just want to stay shiny on the outside and hollow on the inside. When I was 19, I started a small construction company. One truck, one ladder, and one promise. Never charge a man for something you wouldn't pay yourself. It wasn't glamorous, but I built homes that families grew old in. Every nail, every board felt like a conversation with the future. I married Linda, the only woman who ever understood the kind of peace that comes from honest work. Together, we made something stronger than Munia. Home filled with laughter, garden soil, and coffee that never ran out. We never imagined that someday, the house we built would be the only thing left standing between me and loneliness. Linda and I had one daughter, Emily. From the moment she was born, I promised myself I'd give her the kind of life my parents couldn't give me. I'd take her to school every morning, even when work started at 6. I'd sit through every piano recital, no matter how tired I was. When Linda got sick, the kind of sickness you can build your way out of, Emily was only 16. She watched her mother fade, and I watched the light in my daughter's eyes dim with her. Back then, Then I told Emily something I didn't realize she'd one day forget. Didn't ever let the world tell you kindness is weakness. After Linda passed, I threw myself into work. My grief became concrete and drywall. I started taking on bigger projects, housing developments, commercial buildings, even municipal contracts. People began calling me Mr. Lane, as if I'd suddenly become someone worth listening to. But inside, I was still just a man trying to build something his wife would have been proud of. Emily went off to college, the first in our family to do it. I couldn't have been prouder. I still remember waving goodbye as she left for Boston, pretending not to cry until she was gone. That goodbye felt like the start of her new life, and the beginning of my quiet one. I believed I had taught her everything she needed to know. I thought the foundation was strong, but Evan was about to test it in a way I never saw coming. And little did he know, he was testing me, too. A man who had spent his life building things was now about to learn what happens when you start tearing them down. This story is about what happened next. It asks about the true price of respect and what a father does when he is pushed too far. College did what it was supposed to. It changed her. When my daughter, Emily, came home that first Thanksgiving, she was different, spoke faster, dressed sharper, and threw around words like networking and opportunity. She even told me I should think about modernizing my business. I just smiled and said, maybe someday. But I saw how she looked at my old pickup, at the grease stains on my hands. It wasn't disgust, not yet. It was something softer, but more dangerous, embarrassed. I didn't blame her for wanting more. I just never thought more would mean less of me. Over the years, Emily's visits got shorter, her calls less frequent. Then she told me she'd met someone. I was genuinely happy for her. I wanted her to have the kind of love her mother and I had shared. His name was Evan. From our first phone call, I could tell he came from a different world. It was bold, well-spoken, ambitious, the kind of man who could sell your dream before you even knew what it cost. Emily adored him. He understands where I want to go. Dad, she told me once. I remember answering quietly, just don't forget where you came from. But I could already hear it, that small, distant echo of separation that starts when love meets pride. The first time they visited, Evan wore a suit on a Sunday. My home, smelling of roast chicken and sawdust, must have seemed like another planet. He complimented my rustic aesthetic, like it was something from a catalog, not 30 years of my life and hard labor. At dinner, he talked mostly about himself, his plans, his ventures, his startup connections. I smiled and listened, even though half of it was like a foreign language. I really wanted to like him. For Emily's sake, for my late wife Linda's memory. But some people have a way of shaking your hand while looking right past you, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. After they left that night, I sat by the window for a long time, watching their taillights disappear into the dark. I whispered to Linda's picture, "He's not a bad guy, just proud." But a voice inside me, the one that's never been wrong, said, "Pride always asks for payment." I pushed that thought away. Emily was happy, and I told myself that was enough. But happiness that depends on looking down on others never lasts. It just waits to fall. Over the next year, I started seeing the cracks. Evan began managing Emily's finances, for efficiency. He suggested she'll reduce her visits to focus on priorities. He always found polite ways to remind her how lucky she was to have a man with his kind of vision. One evening, Emily called, her voice sounding small. "Dad, you trust him, right?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment, then said, "I trust you, sweetheart." Because I did, or at least I wanted to. That was the night I realized that trust is a gift, and you shouldn't give it to people who don't value it. A few months later, they announced the wedding. It felt fast, too fast, but I didn't say anything. She sounded so excited, and the joy was all I'd ever wanted to protect. The invitations arrived, embossed with gold, feeling heavy in my hands. I was proud she could afford such things, even as I wondered who was really paying for them. I mailed my RSVP with a smile, not knowing I was signing up for my own quiet humiliation. Sometimes, life doesn't warn you before it tests you. It just hands you the exam and watches to see what you'll do. So, I spent the next few weeks preparing my gift. Not because I had to, but because giving has always been my way of loving. The wedding day arrived, sunny and bright. I wore my best navy suit, the same one from Emily's graduation. It was a little tighter now, but it felt right. I tucked the envelope with the check into my inside pocket, close to my heart. That number didn't matter to me. It was a promise fulfilled. I didn't know that by the end of the night, that envelope would become the most powerful lesson in my life. The venue was like something from a movie. Marble floors, chandeliers like frozen rain, and flowers so perfect they looked fake. I arrived early, hoping to help, but the staff politely told me everything was handled. So I just stood there awkwardly, watching people in expensive clothes move past me like I was part of the decor. A few guests gave me that tight, polite smile that says, "I don't know who you are, but I'll pretend you matter for a second." It's a strange feeling, being invisible at your own daughter's wedding. But I was about to learn that sometimes invisibility screams. When Emily walked down the aisle, I forgot everything else. She was radiant, glowing just like her mother used to. My heart swelled, and I whispered, "Linda, look at our girl." I imagined her sitting beside me, smiling through tears. For a moment, I believed it was all going to be okay. But beauty can be a disguise, especially when pride is standing right behind it. The reception started, and the first sign of trouble came from the seating chart. I wasn't at the main table with Emily and Evan. I was at table 19, in the far back corner, next to the kitchen doors. I found my seat among distant cousins and a few of Evan's co-workers who clearly didn't want to be there. I tried to catch Emily's eye, but she was laughing, lost in her new world. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. Then came the speeches. Evan's father, a polished lawyer, spoke eloquently about legacy and ambition. Emily's maid of honor told funny stories from their college days. But my name was never called. I sat there, the father of the bride, with my carefully prepared words unspoken, my gift still hidden in my pocket. The silence was deafening. My daughter, my Emily, hadn't saved a place for me at her table or in her celebration. Evan was subtly, but surely, erasing me from the picture. Finally, Evan stood up to give his groom's speech. He thanked everyone, praised his own family, and then he looked toward my table. And of course, he said with a charming smile, "We have to thank Emily's father. He couldn't contribute financially, but his presence is appreciated." The room filled with polite, pitiful applause. It hit me like a physical blow. Humiliation. He had publicly painted me as a poor, simple man who couldn't provide for his daughter. He had used my love as a prop in his own success story. That was it. The breaking point. The quiet man from table 19 was done being quiet. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me. I saw a flash of panic in Emily's eyes and a flicker of anger in Evan's. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the main table. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I stopped right in front of Evan. I looked him dead in the eye and said, my voice clear and firm, "You're right. A father's love isn't about money." Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. I held it up for everyone to see. "This is a wedding gift for my daughter," I announced. "Not for you." I turned to Emily, whose face was a mask of confusion and shame. "I was going to give this to you privately, sweetheart. It's for you to build your future." I opened the envelope and took out the check. I showed it to her. "But a gift is only a gift if it's received with respect," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And respect is something that has been missing tonight." I looked from Evan's stunned face to Emily's tear-streaked one. "You two need to decide what value really means." And with that, I took the check, tore it cleanly in half, and let the pieces flutter to the floor. A stunned silence filled the hall. I turned and walked away, not looking back. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a profound sadness and a strange sense of liberation. I walked out of that palace of pride and back into the real world, my head held high. I had lost a fantasy, but I had reclaimed my dignity, because true wealth isn't what you can give, it's what you refuse to lose. And I was not going to lose myself, not for anyone. The ceremony was flawless. The vows were poetic, modern, and far more eloquent than anything I could have written myself. When the officiant declared, "You may kiss the bride," the room burst into applause, champagne glasses clinking like a symphony of wind chimes. I forced a smile, even as I caught Evan's parents stealing a glance at me from the front row. It was quick, polite, but undeniably cold. I could almost hear their unspoken judgment. Construction man. Rough hands. Old money. But I pushed it aside. I was there for Emily. That was the only thing that mattered. Sometimes, love means embracing a silence that costs you your dignity. The reception hall was even more magnificent. Waiters drifted through the crowd with trays of champagne and appetizers I couldn't even pronounce. A smooth jazz band played in the corner, the kind of music designed to make everyone feel richer than they actually are. When Emily and Evan took the stage for their first dance, a wave of applause washed over the room. I took a small, careful sip of my champagne and let myself think about how far she'd come, from that little girl with paint smudged on her hands to this. A woman married into wealth, grace, and a kind of power I had never known. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind wondered if she'd traded genuine love for their approval. As the night wore on, I found myself relegated to a table near the back, surrounded by distant relatives and a few strangers. It was clear nobody knew who I was. Someone finally asked, with polite curiosity, "And how do you know the happy couple?" I smiled and replied, "I built her first treehouse." They laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. My eyes scanned the room, searching for Emily. She was a whirlwind of activity, talking, laughing, dancing. But not once did her gaze find mine. It was in that moment a heavy realization settled in my chest. You can give your child the entire world, but you can't force them to see you once they believe they've outgrown you. Then came the speeches. Evan's best man kicked things off with a few lighthearted jokes about their college days. Then, his father took the microphone for a long, grand toast about legacy and future generations. It was polished, impersonal, and drew the kind of applause born from obligation. Suddenly, someone, I think it was the wedding planner, announced, "Now, let's hear a few words from the bride's father." For a heart-stopping moment, I froze. I hadn't prepared a speech, but then again, I didn't need one. My whole life had been preparation for this moment. I stood up, my knees stiff from sitting, and made the long walk to the microphone. The room felt simultaneously vast and suffocating. I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice softer than I intended. I'm not a man of many words, but I am a man of love. And today, I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of my daughter. She has been the greatest joy of my life, and seeing her happy is all I've ever wanted. The crowd offered a polite, muted clap. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. "Emily," I said, holding it up, "this is my wedding gift to you and Evan. It's everything your mother and I worked for our entire lives. Use it to build something real, something that lasts." A quiet murmur rippled through the room, a mixture of surprise and maybe a little admiration. But then, Evan stepped forward. His smile was plastered on, but his eyes were like ice. He took the microphone from the stand, let out a small chuckle, and said, "Wow, that's incredibly generous. But honestly, Mr. Lane, the greatest gift you could give us is to just relax and let us handle our future from here." Laughter trickled across the room. It was a quiet, uncomfortable laughter, the kind that cuts deeper than any shouted insult. I felt every single pair of eyes turn to me. Even Emily looked uneasy, her face pale, but she said nothing. Evan, emboldened by the reaction, went on with a slight smirk. "You've done your part, sir. You built your life, your legacy. Now, maybe it's time to let the new generation take it from here." Sometimes, the greatest gift is if you disappear. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't loud or overtly cruel, just surgically precise, like a scalpel that doesn't make you bleed until much, much later. The room fell into a heavy silence. I heard a nervous cough, the clink of a glass. I just stood there, holding that envelope, realizing that with one sentence, he'd stripped me of my identity, of everything I thought I was in that room. It's a strange thing, humiliation. It doesn't roar, it whispers, and that whisper echoes in your head long after the crowd has forgotten and moved on. Emily finally stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Dad, he didn't mean it like that," she whispered, but her voice trembled, betraying her words. I looked at her, my little girl, and for the first time, I saw a stranger standing in her place. A soft, sad smile touched my lips. "It's all right, sweetheart." I folded the envelope and slipped it back into my pocket. The rest of the evening was a blur. People started avoiding my gaze, treating me like a piece of broken glass on the dance floor, afraid to get too close. I left quietly, without any goodbyes, without making a scene. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, the kind of cold that jolts you awake from a dream you desperately wanted to believe in. I sat in my truck for a long time, just watching the golden lights of the reception hall flicker through the windshield. Inside, my daughter was dancing, laughing, living her new life. And I was learning the painful art of letting go, because sometimes the only way to teach someone your true worth is to let them experience life without it. As I drove home, the envelope sat on the passenger seat, its weight feeling heavier than just paper and ink. I glanced at it and whispered to the empty truck, "You're coming home with me." Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because, for the first time in years, I realized I had been giving far too much of myself to people who had already stopped seeing me. And when a man finally rediscovers his own value, that's the precise moment his revenge quietly begins to right itself. I came home long after midnight. The driveway was empty, and the porch light flickered like an old, tired heartbeat. Inside, the house was silent, but it was the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. I took off my jacket, placed an envelope on the kitchen table, and just stared at it. For 40 years, that table had been where our life unfolded: birthdays, family dinners, the sound of Linda's laughter. Now, it was just a piece of wood holding the weight of what was left of my love. Some silences aren't peaceful. They're just the pause before you have to rebuild yourself from the ground up. My hands were still trembling, but I made a cup of coffee. Old habits die hard. As the kettle hissed, I found myself talking to Linda again, as if she were right there with me. "You'd have told me to let it go," I murmured. "You always believed people come around eventually, but this time you know better." Sometimes, people don't come around. They just keep circling themselves until they think they're the center of the universe. And in those moments, you have to stop orbiting them. For the next few days, I didn't answer any calls. Emily left a few voicemails. Her voice gentle, apologetic. "Dad, please, call me back." Evan didn't mean it that way. But every time I tried to call her, my voice caught in my throat. I wasn't angry at her. I was disappointed in myself for raising her to think that silence was the right response to disrespect. I kept replaying the wedding in my mind, his cutting words. The realtor asked, "Starting over?" I just smiled and said, "No, just going back to where I started." Because sometimes, the most effective revenge begins not with anger, but with finding your own peace. Life in the cabin was simple. I'd wake up with the sunrise, brew a strong coffee, and watch the mist roll across the lake like a soft, gray blanket. I started reading again, opening books I'd once been too busy to touch. I started fixing things for my new neighbors. Fences, porches, leaky roofs. They'd pay me in homemade pies, favors, and friendship. Nobody cared who I used to be. I wasn't Mr. Lane the builder or the man with all the money. I was just an old man with steady hands and quiet eyes. I knew how it eats men who run before they learn to walk. Still, I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet, knowing that time has its own way of evening things out. Karma, I realized, doesn't rush. It waits for the right silence to make its move. Months passed, the seasons changed. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Not a call, a real letter, written in Emily's neat handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long while before opening it. "Dad," it began, "I miss you. Things have been hard. Evan says the market's just adjusting, but I can tell he's hiding something from me. We could really use your advice. Please, come visit. Love, Emily." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. My heart ached, not because she needed me again, but because she only realized it when her world began to wobble. That evening, I sat by the lake, watching the ripples fade into stillness. "You'll come when you're ready, sweetheart," I whispered to the wind. Because the strongest lessons don't come from what we say. They come from what we no longer fix for others. The next month brought another letter, but this one wasn't from Emily. It was from the bank. I still had joint ownership over one of my old commercial properties one ID quietly transferred years ago but never fully finalized the paperwork on. It turns out, Evan had taken out massive loans against it, assuming it was fully his through his marriage to Emily. The bank was foreclosing, and my signature was still required for any resolution. For the first time in a long, long time, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of malice, but one of pure, simple understanding. He'd built his entire empire on a foundation that wasn't his to stand on. My silence, it seemed, had finally ripened into consequence. Sometimes, doing nothing is the most powerful action a man can take. I told him to sell it every brick. Every enchant transferred the funds into a trust under my name alone. When he asked why, I just said, because I've spent a lifetime giving. Now, I'm just keeping what's mine. It wasn't revenge. It was a correction. And sometimes, correction looks a lot like karma finally catching up. A few weeks later, the sale went through. My account balance climbed higher than it had in years. But there was no thrill, no sense of victory, only peace. I didn't rush to tell Emily. She didn't need my words yet. She needed time to see the world without someone else shielding her from its consequences. So, I stayed silent. I chopped wood. I fixed a neighbor's porch. That winter, Emily finally came. She arrived unannounced, pulling up in a car to fancy for the dirt road that led to my cabin. I saw her through the window, standing there in the snow, wrapped in a coat that couldn't quite hide how small she looked. I opened the door before she even had a chance to knock. "Dad," she whispered, tears already falling. I just nodded and motioned her inside. She told me everything. The failed deals, the lawsuits, the creditors. Evan, her husband, had overextended, taking risky loans under both their names. The house was being repossessed. "He said you'd help," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He said you wouldn't let your only daughter suffer." I listened quietly, letting every word find its place. When she was done, I simply asked, "Did he ever apologize for what he said at your wedding?" She lowered her head. "He said he didn't mean it." I nodded slowly. "Then he's learned nothing. You see, sometimes the world doesn't punish arrogance. It just lets arrogance punish itself." I poured her some tea, the same kind her mother used to make. "Emily," I said softly, "I'll always be your father, and you'll always have a place in my heart. But some lessons, my dear, can't be bought back with tears." Saluk Dap, her eyes red, and whispered, "So, you won't help?" I smiled gently. "I already did, years ago. You just gave it away." Her tears fell harder then. Not because of the money, but because she finally saw the man she'd mistaken for weak standing stronger than ever. I didn't gloat. I didn't scold. I just handed her a small, folded note. Inside was a single line. "The greatest gift isn't if I disappear. It's if I finally let you see what disappearing costs." She left quietly the next morning. I watched her car fade into the distance, the same way I once watched her drive off to college. But this time, there was no ache, only a profound calm. I'd given her space to become who she was, and now the world was giving her space to understand who I'd always been. And when peace replaces pain, that's when you know your revenge is complete, even if you never sought it in the first place. The weeks after Emily's visit passed like the quiet hours before dawn still, reflective, almost sacred. I didn't chase her. I didn't call to ask what happened next. I simply went back to my routine, fixing things, reading, and watching the snow melt off the trees. But in the stillness of that cabin, I began to feel something shift. The kind of shift you can't hear or see, only sense, like the earth turning beneath your feet. Because when truth starts moving, it doesn't need an announcement. It just arrives. One morning, I stopped by the local diner for breakfast. I stared at it for a long moment before folding the paper neatly. There was no glee, no triumph, just quiet closure, because I'd seen it all before. Young men, too proud to listen, building castles on borrowed ground. And every time, the same thing happens. A wind of truth eventually knocks on their door. The world has a way of humbling those who think they own it. Martha poured me more coffee. "You knew him, didn't you?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Once upon a time, I called him family." She hesitated, then said softly, "Guess the apple doesn't always fall close, huh?" I smiled faintly. "Sometimes it rolls downhill and has to climb back up before it learns what roots feel like." That was the first morning I truly understood that revenge doesn't need an audience. Only Patien's days turned into weeks. I learned that Evan had fled the state after being indicted for fraud and tax evasion. His investors were demanding repayment, his assets frozen. Emily had filed for divorce quietly, without press or noise. I didn't reach out, not yet. Some lessons need time to echo through silence before words can even begin to heal. But then one evening, I received another letter. This one wasn't too neat, like before. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. "Dad, I'm sorry. I see it now, all of it. I let pride blind me. I thought Evan's world was strength, but it was just noise. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to come home." Emily, I read the letter twice, then set it on the table beside my coffee cup. The lake outside shimmered under the moonlight, and I could almost hear my late wife, Linda's voice, whisper, "Let her come home." Because forgiveness, when given at the right time, doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. When Emily arrived a few days later, she didn't bring expensive bags or wear designer shoes, just a small suitcase and a face that looked older than her years. We took walks by the lake, talking about her mother, about the past, and about mistakes that still stung but no longer defined us. One morning, I found her sitting by the dock, holding the old wedding envelope I had kept all this time. She looked at it quietly and said, "This was supposed to be our future." I sat beside her. "It still can be, just not in the way you thought, because money loses all meaning when it's tied to people who've never earned your respect. It means the world. Stay safe and take care." It had been almost a year since that wedding night. The seasons had quietly turned, and I'd stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. The silence between my daughter and me had stretched on for so long it felt like another kind of death. But life has a strange rhythm. Just when you think everything has gone still, you start to hear it hum again. One evening, my lawyer called. He sounded almost apologetic. "Edward," he said, "they came to me asking about the funds. Looks like their investment tanked. They thought you'd wired the money last year." I smiled. "Of course, they did. The check they never cashed was still in my safe, sealed in the same envelope, untouched, like a secret waiting for its moment." The time had finally come for silence to speak louder than pride. A few days later, I was sitting in the same cafe where I'd once had breakfast with my daughter before her engagement. The place still smelled of maple syrup and burnt toast. When the door opened, I saw her. She looked older, thinner, and her eyes carried a weariness that broke my heart. She walked slowly, each step heavy with regret. She didn't order anything. She just sat across from me and whispered, "Dad." I didn't know. Her voice cracked, and for the first time in years, she didn't look like the successful woman Evan had sculpted. She looked like my little girl again. And in that moment, anger didn't win. "Loudest," she told me everything. How Evan had lost nearly all their money in a risky investment scheme. How he'd started blaming her, drinking too much, and staying out late. He'd gambled their future on a deal he didn't understand, and when the money ran dry, so did his affection. Then she said he finally admitted, one night, that he only married her because he thought I would hand over my company too. It felt strange, hearing this not with anger, but with a quiet understanding, because men like him always reveal their true colors eventually. You just have to give them enough time and rope. I realized then that revenge doesn't always come from action. Sometimes it comes from patience. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the envelope on the table. Her eyes widened. "Is that?" I just nodded. "The same check. Never cashed. Never touched." She broke down, covering her face with trembling hands. "I thought you hated me," she whispered through her tears. I smiled softly. "Hate doesn't build anything, sweetheart. It just waits, and sometimes waiting is the best way to let the truth find its way back." She reached across the table and gripped my hand, just like she used to when she was 5. In that simple touch, years of distance melted away. Evan didn't last much longer in her life. She filed for divorce quietly, with no drama or headlines. He tried to fight for alimony, but the court didn't take kindly to men who lie on their financial records. My daughter moved back to the countryside, closer to where her mother and I had built our first home. She visits me now, sometimes bringing groceries, other times just sitting in silence as we watch the sunset together. There's peace again, not the kind built on wealth or revenge, but the kind built on rediscovered love. As the world slowed down, I finally felt like my wife's promise had come true, that kindness, even when forgotten, always finds its way back home. I had never told her that I'd sold the property and recovered everything Evan thought he owned. To her, I was still the man who lived simply, quietly. I wanted it that way. I didn't need her to see wealth. I needed her to see worth. But one evening, as we watched the sun set over the water, I handed her a sealed envelope smaller this time. Inside was a deed. She looked at it, confused. "Dad, what is this?" "It's the cabin," I said. "Yours, when you're ready." Her eyes widened. "You're giving it to me." I smiled softly. "No, I'm trusting you with it." Because trust, once rebuilt, is the rarest form of inheritance. Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," I said quietly. "You just did, by coming home." That night, as she slept peacefully in the next room, I sat by the fire, thinking about how life circles back. I remembered Evan's words, "The greatest gift is if you disappear." Funny thing about disappearing's, when you step back, people finally see what they lost. And when they do, your absence becomes the mirror they can't look away from. Disappearing, I realized, isn't defeat, it's revelation. Months later, I got news that Evan had been sentenced. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was long enough to learn humility. He'd tried to reach out to Emily through her lawyer, asking for forgiveness. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Life had already answered for her. Because some apologies come too late, and some silences speak louder than regret. Emily eventually found a job teaching art at a local community center. Modest pay, but honest work. The kind her mother would have smiled at. Every day, she came home with paint on her hands and stories about her students. Her laughter filled the cabin again, like sunlight pouring through dusty windows. One evening, as we ate dinner by candlelight, she looked at me and said, "Dad, I finally understand why you didn't fight back that night." "You didn't need to," I chuckled. "Revenge isn't about shouting, kiddo. It's about standing still long enough for the truth to catch up. And when truth finally catches up, it never misses." The next morning, she handed me a letter she'd written to her mother. It said, "Mom, Dad finally taught me what strength really is. It isn't loud or proud. It's patient, kind, and quiet. The kind that waits until the storm passes and still stands tall." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside Linda's picture on the mantelpiece. I didn't cry, not out of sadness, but gratitude. For everything. The pain, the loss, the silence, all of it had led us here. Because sometimes life breaks you just enough to rebuild you, right? People often think revenge is about destruction, about taking back what's yours in a fury. But life taught me that real revenge is letting time reveal the truth while you stand still, unshaken. When Evan sighed, "The greatest gift is if you disappear," he thought. Disappearing meant defeat. But sometimes, disappearing just means removing yourself from people too small to understand your worth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ruin his life. I just let him live long enough to ruin it himself. And when my daughter came back, not for money, but for forgiveness, I realized my silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. Now, every morning, when I walk through my garden and hear the birds, I think of all the things I once gave away freely: love, trust, years, and I smile, knowing that the greatest gift I ever gave wasn't money, or stocks, or comfort. It was the lesson that respect can't be bought. It's earned one quiet moment at a time. So if anyone ever tells you that the greatest gift is your disappearance, don't argue. Just smile. Step back and let life do what it always does. Balance the scales in its own silent, perfect way. Because karma doesn't rush, it always arrives right on time. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. We'll see you in the next one.